Today we're joined on the phone by Steve Parke. He is the author of the new book, Picturing Prince, also a former art director for Prince. Steve, I got to say, it's great to be speaking with you. Thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Well, let's talk a bit about your new book, Picturing Prince. A lot of Prince fans here in Minnesota, of course. What are the listeners in for with this book?
Hopefully they are in for getting to know a little bit about, what it was like to work with Prince and sort of, a little bit of my story with him and sort of how he engaged the people around him to push themselves and try things that you would never think you'd do just because he sort of offered a lot of opportunities. So I think that's something that people have routinely been surprised by because, outside of, I think the one thing about Minnesota, about Minneapolis, that area, they kind of knew that, his studios were a workplace. And outside of that, you get a lot of people who just think, well, parties all the time and, who knows what all going on in there. And I'm like, I feel like I'm disappointing people a little bit by letting them know that, in fact, he was in there working really hard. Doesn't mean it wasn't interesting and doesn't mean it wasn't creative, of course, but it was definitely not a den of iniquity,
Yeah, and the book, and there's some amazing pictures throughout it, and you got a foreword by Sheila E. as well, so definitely a great book for the Prince fans out there.
Yeah, I hope so. So far, it's been well received by people, which I'm really grateful for.
Well, Steve, can you tell us a bit about how, I guess, you wound up working for Prince? It seems like kind of a dream job for somebody who would be in the photography business.
Oh, absolutely. Well, and ironically, I didn't start off with photography with him. The first job that I was hired for was to paint a set for one of his videos in 1988. And I came in and I did that job very quickly, And that steamrolled into ultimately doing the photography with him. But I also, along the way, had the opportunities to, do more set work, design some sets. I painted a base for him. I did tour shirts, tour programs, ended up designing CD packaging. I painted the cover of the Graffiti Bridge album cover. So I sort of just kept being offered things to do, and I tackled them, and he was pleased with them, and he offered me more. So the photography came out of that. He just said one day, kind of like, "Hey, you want to shoot some pictures?" And I'm like, "Why not?" And fortunately, I'd had some experience in college, and so it wasn't a total, something totally outside of my skill set, but I was also working with early digital cameras, which were a whole different thing than they are today. People are like, "Oh yeah, I've got a phone in my camera in my phone," and those cameras are better than what I was working with at probably a $40,000 to $50,000 price point back then, because it was all new technology, and not quite there yet either. So in addition to the actual photography, that I had to become a technician on the backside to get the images to look good.
Awesome. Again, Steve Parke with us today, and we're talking about his new book, Picturing Prince. And you mentioned starting to work with him around 1988. That was really a transitional time for Prince. You mentioned Graffiti Bridge, and he was doing the movie, and also fighting with Warner Brothers and changing his name. So I imagine maybe you were on call 24/7 at that time.
It was. When I first went out there, definitely was that. Then he went on tour, and I sort of was left not knowing if I'd work with him again. And when he came back, they started having more things for me to do. They actually called me out while he was on tour in the UK to come out and paint something out there they needed for a festival-style stage, which was different than the stage in the Round at the time. So I kept picking work up, and ultimately speaking, in the time that I was sort of had downtime, I thought, well, I've got to figure out if this doesn't work out, what else I'm going to do. And I was painting at that time, and I painted something to show art directors that happened to have Prince in it, because I thought, well, you might see it and think, "Ooh, this would be cool. I could have him do something like this for me." And that actually ended up becoming the Graffiti Bridge album cover. So that was pretty interesting, because it wasn't something where he said, "I need these elements." I just kind of was randomly putting elements in, but I was thinking to myself, what would be kind of a cool thing to be in there with Prince, and ultimately he really liked it. I had to add Morris Day and Ingrid Chavez for the movie. So yeah, that was that was sort of interesting, that pushing through all of that, and then in fact, ending up designing for him while his name was a symbol, which had its own issues because the symbol's interesting to design around. People think that symbol, they think of a circle in it, but it actually creates like a weird space, and trying to design around that. And, having him instruct me to do an album cover that looks pretty raw and whatever, because he basically was looking at Warner Brothers as a bit of an enemy at the time, and it was very interesting, to say the least. But it was interesting because it also presented a lot of cool challenges. Maybe at the time it didn't seem that cool, but in the end, it was very interesting to have gone through that experience. Kind of going through the roller coaster ride with him on some of the things he was doing.
Well, and going through the book, it seems like you developed a friendship with Prince, and you kind of caught him and, doing normal things. It's tough for people to think of Prince as just, an average guy, maybe doing normal things around the house.
Sure. And he was and he wasn't because I always said there was a sense of normalcy that was specific to working there, to being there, because you get used to things. Like, if he's calling for something, like, one of my stories in the book is about they were looking for a camel for a photo shoot, but it was kind of last minute. And so then it's like, hey, we need to get a camel at midnight, and in Minneapolis. And it's just, where else do you get that request for an actual camel at midnight in Minneapolis? Pretty much nowhere else that I can think of, And so it was interesting because those things didn't seem that out of character. They weren't always possible exactly the way he wanted them, but he would decide that's what he wanted, and we'd figure out a way to make something happen. So normal was a little bit different, for him. Even some of the shots with him in the Arboretum, Chanhassen Arboretum, which I think he was very relaxed in. Again, it's interesting to basically be in a situation where you're sitting working for somebody and they say, hey, let's go shoot some photos. I got this place down the street that's really cool. Okay. I mean, that's not an everyday occurrence, but for him, it was. But it was also a place where he obviously liked to spend time and relax, and I think that was reflected in his photos. We didn't do a lot of super candid photos because he always had a little bit of a sense of self. I guess if you have someone with a camera standing there, you are going to have a little bit of the sense that that's happening. Sure. And so, I was thinking, somebody asked me what they thought the most candid shots were, and I think him getting his hair done, even though he knew I was doing it, I don't know that he was thinking he would want to keep those shots. I think he was just thinking like, oh, well, let's do it and see how they come out. And he liked it. He liked the fact that it was something that he did. And then there was a shot of him and Maite in the book where I caught them at a club in Spain, and honestly, I had no thoughts I would catch that shot because it was completely dark in there. And really, I just saw that moment between the two of them and captured it, and he really liked it. So there were a couple that were very, very casual, but even in the park at the Arboretum, he is relaxed. He is definitely, not everything is posed. He's just sitting sometimes and doing some things, and I caught them, but we certainly went there with a camera, So it's very interesting also what becomes sort of trying to catch him unaware. I think it was very difficult to catch him unaware.
Well, and as far as his work goes, and your designing of things, he seemed like a guy that usually had maybe 2 or 3 dozen different projects going on at once. So I imagine some of the stuff you worked on, maybe it ended up being scrapped or put into the vault. Do you know if maybe there's a lot of that stuff that's waiting to be released here?
Well, musically, absolutely. I don't know where all the artwork ended up because it was definitely, sometimes he would have an idea for something and we'd go down that path and design something, and then it just never saw the light of day, or pieces of that album would become parts of another album, things like that. So I honestly don't know. The technology was still somewhat in its infancy, and even things like backing them up, was an expensive process back then. It was, a gigabyte of data was not as cheap as it is now. I mean, I'm talking gigabytes, not terabytes. It was expensive. And so I think a lot of things, like once they were no longer in his brain, like, oh, we're going to still do this project. He's like, yeah, we're not going to do it. A lot of that probably ended up getting, I hate to say it, probably ended up getting tossed or lost on a hard drive, and probably a hard drive that went bad or corrupt or what have you. So I don't know about the artwork. it'd be great if some of that still existed, but I'm guessing that the music is what you're really going to find, not so much the accompanying artwork for some of it, which is a shame because some of it I really liked. I was very happy with. There was the Truth album was an acoustic album, and we did a really cool package for that, and it just never ended up getting used, which is a shame.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what comes out over the years here. And, we've always heard maybe a lot of music videos or possibly more feature films in there. So, maybe some of that stuff might find its way out eventually as well.
Oh, I hope so. He was filming a lot. He filmed a lot of really great shows out of Paisley, some of which I was there for and always hoped they'd come out. But I don't know. Again, I don't know what was shot on, how video holds up after all those years, how much of it was film, how much of it was video. So yeah, I'm interested to see myself. It would be really cool to see that come out, and I'd be very excited to see it. But yeah, he was definitely making all of that. It's the thing. He was constantly creating things, and kind of whittling down from what he had come up with to make whatever it was going to be his final, piece. And so, yeah, there's a ton of content, if it could all be found and rescued.
Well, and again, the book Picturing Prince is out now, and I know, Steve, you're going to be at the Barnes & Noble here in Edina. Can you describe, I guess, what an appearance might be like for the listeners?
Oh, that's a good question. Hopefully entertaining. In this particular case, Morris Hayes, who was a longtime musician with Prince, he was his keyboard player, but he also was his band leader for a lot of years, and he had a really long amount of time with Prince as a musician because Prince tended to rotate his musicians out with some frequency. And he's going to be talking with me, and hopefully, I said hopefully the audience will have a chance to ask some questions or at least have some interaction, because between he and I, knowing how funny he is and how much I like to talk, people might not get a word in edgewise, but hopefully they will. But basically, we're going to talk some about the book itself, some of the photos and things like that. But I'm sure the nice thing is Morris was around for a lot of that time period, and so it'll be interesting to be able to reflect a little bit on his perspective as a musician, because I definitely had a different relationship, I feel, with Prince doing what I did, because he was not in a position where he could come in and basically tell me, hey, if you can't play that right, I can, So that was good for me. His skill sets didn't extend into, photography and Photoshop, or at least for himself. Actually, he took a lot of photos, and he was actually quite good, had a good eye. Fortunately, it was difficult to set up selfies at that time, so that was good for me, So yeah, so that's what I hope. I hope that we do something entertaining for people and also informative, and that we answer some questions people might have, or talk a little bit about some of the stories in the book if they want some elaboration on those, and who knows, probably come up with some things that I had long forgotten about. Because when I start talking with other people that had worked for him, we are always like, oh, right, I remember that now, that type of thing. So it should be a good time.
Awesome. Yeah, it's, again, the book Picturing Prince out now. And Steve, I know you've worked with basically everybody over the years. So do you know if maybe you have any other upcoming projects or anything like that in the works?
Well, I just did a album cover for Victor Wooten, if you know him, bass player.
Sure.
Just did that, and then actually he's got the #1 jazz album on iTunes this week. And I also worked with Sheila E. on her recent project. And then after that, I've been focused on this book a lot. So hopefully once this book is sort of, it's out there, we've talked about it, people have picked it up, and it's kind of having its own life, I'm going to switch myself back into, trying to hook up with more people and do more work. So I've been spending the last 16 years being here for my son. It's part of the reason I ended up leaving working for Prince, because I wanted to be around for my kid, and he's getting ready to go off to college in a year, so it's going to free me up for a few more creative endeavors, and I'll put myself kind of back out there. I've been hiding a little bit in Baltimore, so that's what I hope for.
Awesome. Well, again, Steve, the book Picturing Prince is amazing, and again, I appreciate your time today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And again, that was Steve Parke, former art director for Prince, and his new book, Picturing Prince, is available now. We'll be back after this.